Hello and welcome to Lawson Literature, Episode 6. My name is George, and in this episode we'll be reviewing the book The Happiness Hypothesis by Jonathan Haidt, which does something vaguely amusing when you open it up, which I'll show you. There you go. So, The Happiness Hypothesis is a self-help book in which Jonathan Haidt attempts to reach a working definition of happiness for today's world. To do this, he borrows from a wide range of sources, from ancient wisdom and philosophy, all the way to modern science. What results is a fascinating combination of ideas, which, when put into action, can increase the level of your happiness in real, tangible, and also subtle ways. Now, as a side note, I should probably mention that you may have noticed that I've been reviewing a lot of self-help books recently, and I think it's important to look at self-help books, particularly if you're quite young, because it helps kind of establish a foundation for your personal development in life. For example, we're not born knowing how to do anything, and yes, we learn a lot from our parents. We learn a lot from the people we meet, teachers, etc. at school, but we don't actually have that theoretical foundation for our personal development that, if we had it, we would know how to build upon. And, like, for example, in relationships, people go into relationships with other people expecting to kind of feel their way around for how relationships work, and they kind of expect that they'll somehow one day know about it, and they probably do in the process of experimenting with it, but they would learn about it a lot quicker if they read about it first and then put that theory into practice. That's not to say you bury your head in books, just books and theory, and you become just a sort of bookworm type character who doesn't engage with the real world. Theory is only half of the process. Then comes practice. And I think this is what you'll find with the happiness hypothesis, is that it is a very theoretical book and has lots of theory. But the key to finding happiness is to then put that theory into practice. So, without further ado, let's begin. Jonathan Haidt starts this book off by examining what prevents our happiness, which is quite a good idea, because if you're trying to be happy, then one of the main ways to do that, one of the first things you should do, is examine the obstacles to that happiness. And in this book, he says that one of the main obstacles to our happiness is the fact that we are divided as people. For example, like, we have different parts within us. We're not all one unity as a being. He explains this whole idea through the metaphor of what he calls the rider and the elephant. So on page 17, he says, "The elephant and the rider both have their own intelligence, and when they work together well, they enable a unique brilliance of human beings, or the unique brilliance of human beings, rather, but don't always work together well." So sometimes what the elephant wants is different to what the rider wants. The rider might be thinking of long-term goals. The rider represents the rational, maybe wise mind that thinks to the future and plans ahead for things. For example, if you're trying to lose weight, and the rider might say, okay, I want to lose weight, I'm going to make this plan over the next few weeks to lose weight, and it's going to go great because I've told myself, I've disciplined myself, and I've told myself, yeah, this is what I'm going to do. But then comes the elephant, and because the elephant is bigger and physically much more in control than the rider, what will happen is that the elephant will pull the rider to wherever its instant desires lead it. So the elephant itself needs to be trained to learn how over time rewards will come in the future, but they just have to wait. Otherwise, they'll go straight for that burger or straight for that ice cream without necessarily knowing about the future potential benefits, because the elephant represents our emotions. It represents how we feel in the moment, and it certainly can't be resisted or got rid of in a way. It has to be accepted and trained. You see. On page 22, Haidt says, "Our minds are loose confederations of parts, but we identify with and pay too much attention to one part, conscious verbal thinking. Because we can see only one little corner of the mind's vast operation, we are surprised when urges, wishes, and temptations emerge, seemingly from nowhere. We make pronouncements, vows, and resolutions, and then are surprised by our own powerlessness to carry them out. We sometimes fall into the view that we are fighting with our unconscious, our ID, or our animal self. But really, we are the whole thing. We are the rider, and we are the elephant." And I really like that metaphor, because you can't get rid of the elephant. The elephant is our desires. The elephant is our emotions that are always looking for instant gratification, always looking for money, sex, food, all these things which can instantly bring them pleasure. And it's the rider's job to train the elephant over time through practice to appreciate the long-term goals the rider or the wiser, rational mind is heading for. And through that, we will reach happiness a lot easier. And what Haidt is saying really here is that we pay too much attention to the rider, and we kind of ignore the elephant. We ignore our desires. We say our desires are stupid. Our desires are pointless. But actually, they do have a point. Our desires come from very basic survival needs. It's just that they need to be evolved and be trained, So we need to learn to tame the elephant instead of resisting it. In chapter 2, Haidt introduces us to how we might go about this whole process of training our minds. So on page 35, Haidt begins by talking about meditation and the advantages of meditation. So he says, quote, there are many kinds of meditation, but they all have in common a conscious attempt to focus attention in a non-analytical way. It sounds easy. Sit still, in most forms, and focus awareness only on your breathing, or on a word, or on an image, and let no other words, ideas, or images arise in consciousness. Meditation is, however, extraordinarily difficult at first, and confronting your repeated failures in the first weeks teaches the rider lessons in humility and patience. The goal of meditation is to change automatic thought processes, thereby taming the elephant. And the proof of taming is in the breaking of attachments. End quote. And I like how you can actually obtain proof that you've tamed the elephant through such a process as meditation by seeing that after meditating for, say, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, you'll realize that actually you're not as attached to your initial desires anymore, to what you initially wanted. You realize that it's not going to make you happy, that you don't need that right away. That's why I think meditation is such a good cure for addiction. So if you're addicted to things like cigarettes, alcohol, internet, coffee, etc., you can, whenever you get that urge, you can make a sort of vow to sit and meditate maybe for 10 minutes. And then if you still feel like you need that, whatever it is, go ahead and go and have your coffee or whatever. But what you'll probably find is that after sitting for 10 minutes and meditating and focusing your attention on, say, a spot on the wall or something, or just you're focusing attention on your breath, which is a great technique for meditation. If you do that for 10 minutes, you will realize that you don't really need what you wanted at that point in time. It's only that in that specific point in time, your elephant or your emotional brain wanted that particular thing. But once you give it time to accustom to the present moment, get accustomed to reality, eventually it kind of almost dissolves away, which is really nice. He talks about another technique later on in this chapter to sort of retrain the mind. This is called cognitive therapy. Now, cognitive therapy was discovered, well, was created rather, during the 1970s by psychiatrist Aaron Beck as a reaction to the traditional processes of psychotherapy that were going on at the time. At that time, a lot of psychotherapists were trying to treat their patients through this Freudian attempt of looking into all their childhood traumas and why things happen certain ways, and uprooting that to try and let it go. But what Beck found was that this approach often made his patients more miserable, because they were reminded of what happened in the past, and that brought up all this mess. Whereas the method that Beck created here is one where you appreciate the thoughts you're having, and you appreciate the thoughts and feelings you're having and everything, and your reaction to them, and all the beliefs you have right now. But you don't necessarily have to inquire into why they're there. You just question them. So Haidt explains this idea of cognitive therapy in more detail when he says that, quote, "We often use reasoning not to find the truth, but to invent arguments to support our deep and intuitive beliefs. Depressed people are convinced in their hearts of three related beliefs, known as Beck's cognitive triad of depression. These are: 1. I'm no good. 2. My world is bleak. And 3. My future is hopeless. A depressed person's mind is filled with automatic thoughts supporting these dysfunctional beliefs, particularly when things go wrong. The thought distortions were so similar across patients that Beck gave them names. Consider the depressed father whose daughter falls down and bangs her head while he is watching her. He instantly flagellates himself with these thoughts. Oh, I'm a terrible father. This one is called personalization, or seeing the event as a referendum on the self rather than as a minor medical issue. He might also think, oh, why do I always do such terrible things to my children? This would be overgeneralization, combined with dichotomous always or never thinking. He might also think, oh, now she's going to have brain damage. That itself is magnification. And he also might think statements such as, oh, everyone will hate me. That itself would be an arbitrary inference, or jumping to a conclusion without evidence, end quote. So I like this example he gives here, because it kind of shows the common thought processes that can go on, in which your self-esteem is slowly eroded away by you attacking yourself through your thoughts. This whole process can be stopped then by questioning the thoughts that come up as they come up in the moment. You don't need to question why those thoughts come. You don't need to question the trauma or go into any of that messy detail. You just need to question the thoughts that are here right now, and question the beliefs that you hold. Because what will happen is that the beliefs you hold about the thoughts will reinforce what you then think in the future about this particular situation. So that is how cognitive therapy breaks these thought patterns and makes you put them into perspective and see them in reality, which is also a great way to train the mind and train the elephant. And also later on in this chapter, Haidt describes the benefits of Prozac and medication used to treat depression or other anxieties. He says, quote, Prozac was the first member of a class of drugs known as selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, or SSRIs. In what follows, I use Prozac to stand for the whole group, the psychological effects of which are nearly identical, and which includes Paxil, Zoloft, Celexa, Lexapro, and others. Many things are not known about Prozac and its cousins, above all, how they work. The name the name of the drug class tells part of the story. Prozac gets into the synapses, the gaps between neurons, but it is selective in using only synapses that use serotonin as their neurotransmitter. Once in the synapses, Prozac inhibits the reuptake process, the normal process in which a neuron that has just released serotonin into the synapse then sucks it back into itself to be released again at the next neural pulse. The net result is that a brain on Prozac has more serotonin in certain synapses, so those neurons fire more often. End quote. Here he gives a very in-depth scientific explanation of how serotonin, more serotonin is created in your brain. Because for a depressed person, they have a lack of it. They have a lack of serotonin, and they need to produce more. Now, serotonin can also be produced through things like exercise. If you notice that after doing exercise, you feel a bit happier. And so exercise is a great solution to that. But if you suffer from depression and you are really in a bad place, there's nothing wrong with getting drugs to help you with that. Some people might say that medication is kind of a quick fix, and it is a quick fix, and it's not the only way to improve. But like anything, it's a technology. For instance, lots of people wear glasses. You could say, oh, that's just a quick fix for your eyesight. But the fact is, it's a technology which helps you have better vision. And the same applies to antidepressants and such other drugs. In Chapter 3, Reciprocity with a Vengeance, Haidt begins with a quote from the Analects of Confucius, who was a ancient Chinese sage. It says, quote, Zigong asked, is there any single word that could guide one's entire life? The master said, should it not be reciprocity? What you do not wish for yourself, do not do to others. End quote. This idea of reciprocity has been embodied through many cultures throughout hundreds of years, thousands of years. As Haidt explains, quote, when the sages pick a single word or principle to elevate above all others, the winner is almost always either love or reciprocity. What is reciprocity? Reciprocity is along the lines of, if you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. Or, I'll give you this as long as you give me this in return. A lot of business transactions are based upon reciprocity, but also most of our relationships are. You know, if we were in a relationship with someone and we gave them everything, but we got nothing in return, that relationship wouldn't benefit us in any way, and that relationship itself would be worthless. So, on page 48, Haidt describes how we see reciprocity in other animals. He says, quote, ultrasocial species display levels of cooperation and self-sacrifice that still astonish and inspire those who study them. Some ants, for example, spend their lives hanging from the top of a tunnel, offering their abdomens for use as food storage bags by the rest of the nest. End quote. Such an amazing image that is of an animal actually sacrificing the use of their abdomens for food storage bags, which they'll offer to the other creatures. and to which they'll offer themselves to the clan, because they know the animals, they at least instinctively feel a sense of importance to the group, and they feel that their relationship and their sense of belonging is so important that in return for this sense of belonging to the group, they're willing to actually offer their abdomens and stuff. But I suppose humans offer it in different ways. They make promises, which you will keep. And if I make this promise to you, you have to make this promise to me. And that's often how kind of relationships between humans work. And of course, this is all down to balance, really. Particularly in intimate relationships, as Haidt describes on page 57, quote, relationships are exquisitely sensitive to balance in their early stages, and a great way to ruin things is either to give too much, you seem perhaps a bit desperate, or too little, you seem cold and rejecting. Rather, relationships grow best by balanced give and take, especially of gifts, favours, attentions, and self-disclosure, end quote. This idea of self-disclosure is an interesting one. It's the idea of telling truth, saying, if I tell you this truth, you would tell me this truth. I mean, ideally in a relationship, in an intimate relationship, you're going to be honest with each other about most things, or if not everything. So self-disclosure is really an important part of that. But also the reciprocity amongst relationships involves gifts, favours, and also giving that person your attention. Particularly in today's world of social media, you may have been lectured about this before, but people are on their phones, looking at the phones, and they're not looking at other people, and this can create some sort of discord in your relationships, because one of the main things that keeps a relationship going is when you 100% focus on that other person. That doesn't mean you don't use your phones or whatever, but you just don't let your phones use up your time, so that you can focus and allocate your time, specific time, to give your full attention to someone else. That's really important. So as Haidt wraps up this chapter, he says on page 58, reciprocity is an all-purpose relationship tonic. Used properly, it strengthens, lengthens, and rejuvenates social ties. It works so well, in part, because the elephant is a natural mimic. And end quote. And he explains this mimic effect in this interesting quote here. Quote, waitresses who mimic their customers get larger tips. End quote. And it's not too hard to see why that's true, because through mimicking someone else, or even just their movements. For example, if a waitress came over and I was sat at a table, and she put the bill there, and I was scratching my nose, and then I saw she was also scratching her nose. And I wouldn't actually consciously think okay, I'll give you a tip now, because you scratched your nose as well as I did. But it's more at a subconscious level that you would feel more inclined to give more of a tip, because they've appreciated your movements a lot more. It's sort of strange how that works. But that's really a side note. I think the point he's making here is that reciprocity is another key ingredient in happiness, because if you can get the reciprocity balance right, you can get your relationships right, and if you can get your relationships right, as he'll explain later in the book, that will help to bring more happiness. In this fourth chapter, The Faults of Others, Haidt discusses this concept of hypocrisy, and how hypocrisy goes forward to prevent our happiness in life. On page 60, he says, quote, one of the most universal pieces of advice from across cultures and eras is that we are all hypocrites, and in our condemnation of others' hypocrisy, we only compound our own. So this can obviously relate to, say, Jesus's quote of before spotting the log in your neighbour's eye, first look at the log in your own eye. Look at your own faults before you judge others. Often we're quick to blame others, and we're quick to try and not just blame others, but to try and solve their problems and try and give them advice because we think we know what's best for them. When in fact, actually, we ignore our own. And of course, the first problems we need to sort out are our own, really, before we can be of more use to other people. And on page 61, he describes how this problem goes deeper with this idea of impression management. He says, quote, "In real life, you don't react to what someone did. You react only to what you think she did, and the gap between action and perception is bridged by the art of impression management." End quote. This is a very interesting quote because it refers to this idea of naive realism. Naive realism is this idea that you think you know what's going on outside your present field of experience. This includes what your relatives are doing, what your friends are doing, what your lover is doing. You think you know what they're doing, and you can imagine what they're doing, even though you don't know what they're doing. Because, for example, I don't know what my dad is doing. My dad isn't in this room right now. Now, I think he's probably driving home from work or something, but I don't know exactly in what way. I don't know where he is on that journey, or I can only guess based on my assumptions about him, about what he's doing, because I'm in this room and I can't see him. Naive realism makes me assume what's happening outside of my current experience. So that's why people who are manipulative are also very good at impression management, because though they may act nice so that you think this act will be reflected in their actions, their actual real actions may not be as nice. Likewise, if someone gives off a bad impression, that doesn't necessarily mean that their actions are bad, because you don't know. The solution, in most cases, then, is to quit this game entirely and be a more authentic individual and stop blaming others based on your assumptions about them. Realize that you might be blaming others for things that never happened, based entirely on your assumptions about them. Moving on page 63, Haidt expands upon this idea of assumptions. He says, quote, "From the person who cuts you off on the highway all the way to the Nazis who ran the concentration camps, most people think they are good people and that their actions are motivated by good reasons. As Robert Wright put it in his masterful book, The Moral Animal, human beings are a species splendid in their array of moral equipment, tragic in their propensity to misuse it, and pathetic in their constitutional ignorance of the misuse." End quote. That's a very wise quote there, because it's all about how we twist morality and our shoulds and should nots to suit our own desires, to suit our own goals. We often ignore the actual real actions of people just so we can forward our own personal agenda. And of course, we think we are good in doing that. This is why it's important to understand villainy, to understand so-called evil people and the myth of pure evil, which Haidt discusses in this book as well. This idea that we think evil exists when actually it doesn't. evil is an opinion. Nothing is either good or bad, only thinking makes it so, as is said in Shakespeare's Hamlet. Your perception of something is what makes something either good or bad. And to the Nazis, for instance, who ran the concentration camps, obviously what they did wasn't right. But they thought it was right. They thought that what they were doing was the right thing. Isn't that incredible? How they could have thought that was the right thing to do? All that disgusting murder. They thought that was the right thing to do. Now, obviously, the case probably isn't as extreme in your own life, but it does make you wonder, are my actions necessarily good? Are the actions I think are good actually good in reality? It's an interesting question to ponder, that one. And the more you do, the more you can probably tap into your authentic self. On page 79, he gets you to consider your own faults with this exercise. Quote, and you can do this yourself, by the way. Quote, think of a recent interpersonal conflict with someone you care about, and then find one way in which your behaviour was not exemplary. Maybe you did something insensitive, even if you had a right to do it, or hurtful, even if you meant well, or inconsistent with your principles, even though you can readily justify it. When you first catch sight of a fault in yourself, you'll likely hear frantic arguments from your inner lawyer excusing you and blaming others, but try not to listen. You are on a mission to find at least one thing that you did wrong. When you find a fault in yourself, it will hurt, briefly, but if you keep going and acknowledge the fault, you are likely to be rewarded with a flash of pleasure that is mixed, oddly, with a hint of pride. It is the pleasure of taking responsibility for your own behaviour. It is the feeling of honour. End quote. And this is the reward you get when you actually look inside yourself and see your own problems, as opposed to blaming others, is this feeling of honour. And it's a very real feeling. It's a feeling of acceptance of yourself, actually. Because you're accepting not only yourself, but you're accepting others and what you've done to them. You've accepted that though that act was wrong, you've now acknowledged that, and now you're willing to move on. Very few people, I find, are able to do this. But as Haidt says on page 80, by summing this up, quote, by seeing the log in your own eye, you can become less biased, less moralistic, and therefore less inclined toward argument and conflict. You can begin to follow the perfect way, the path to happiness that leads through acceptance, which is the subject of the next chapter. End quote. And just before we move on to the next chapter, I'd like to kind of sum up this chapter we've just discussed, in that I think the main point you want to take away is this idea of responsibility. The more responsibility you take for your life and the challenges in it, as opposed to blaming others for your problems and blaming others for all the problems that happen, the more responsibility you take on, the more control you will feel over your life, and therefore the more happiness you will feel as a result of that. In chapter 5, Haidt discusses the pursuit of happiness. And by the way, apologies for this, but actually it's Haidt, not hate. That's the pronunciation I've just discovered now. So just bear that in mind when pronouncing the author's name. Haidt discusses this idea that there are many different ways to pursue happiness, and many ways have been discovered throughout history. But because society has changed a lot over the past 100 to 1,000 years or so, a lot of the advice given by, say, sages and mystics, though it might be very useful, could also be very outdated, very sort of quite rusty as well. So to sort of show the limits of ancient wisdom, on page 82, Haidt says, quote, Buddhism and Stoicism teach that striving for external goods, or to make the world conform to your wishes, is always a striving after wind. Happiness can only be found from within, by breaking attachments to external things and cultivating an attitude of acceptance. But recent research in psychology suggests that Buddha and Epictetus may have taken things too far. Some things are worth striving for, and happiness comes in part from outside of yourself, if you know where to look. End quote. That's a very interesting one, because if you're very interested in spirituality, like me, or other people, you'll probably get this idea that to achieve happiness or to achieve enlightenment, you need to break all your attachments to everything, and to all your relationships and so on, and go and off and live in a cave or something. And I suppose many people have done that and sort of found a way to happiness through that. But another way to happiness could also be through the conditions of your external life. That may heavily influence your happiness, and that's what Haidt is trying to describe here. For example, a lot of what our happiness might come from what we do, which involves external things. So, for example, I get happiness from writing, and that involves using a keypad or a pen, and that's an external thing in itself, and that's producing an external artifact, an external piece of artwork. So he describes here how enjoying whatever you're doing in the moment might bring more happiness than what you think you'll get out of that in the future. He says, quote, we can call this the progress principle. Pleasure comes more from making progress towards goals than from achieving them. Shakespeare captured it perfectly. He said, quote, things won are done. Joy's soul lies in the doing. End quote. So the more you enjoy what you're doing rather than focus on what you're going to get out of what you're doing, the more happiness you will get from that activity. And that's easier said than done, because often when we're doing things, we're so focused on what we're going to get out of it rather than kind of mindfully enjoying what we're doing in the moment. And on page 86, Haidt discusses this idea of a biological set point, and how a lot of us are set to experience are more inclined to experience happiness because of our genes. He says, quote, in the long run, it doesn't much matter what happens to you. Good fortune or bad, you will always return to your happiness set point, your brain's default level of happiness, which was determined largely by your genes, end quote. Now, of course, and Haidt emphasizes this as well, that doesn't necessarily mean that you won't be happy if, like me, you have a low biological set point. It just means that you might have to maybe work a bit harder on some of these pursuits, or also you can move up within your range. Each happiness set point isn't fixed on one point. It's kind of in a range. There's a range within this set point. So you can either go from unhappy to happy within your particular set point. So if you pursue happiness, that you will become more happy, even though your set point is lower. But also you shouldn't worry then about what happens to you as well. And later on, he discusses the potential happiness that can come from money. A lot of people either think that money will bring them happiness, or that money doesn't bring happiness at all. And the answer is really, like many things, a balance. As Haidt says, quote, the most widely reported conclusion from surveys done by psychologist Ed Diner, I believe it's pronounced, is that within any given country, at the lowest end of the income scale, money does buy happiness. But Once you are freed from the basic needs and have entered the middle class, the relationship between wealth and happiness becomes smaller. And this is a very good illustration of how money relates to happiness, because you can go from one extreme to the other, really, and say money doesn't buy happiness or money does. But I think it's more complicated than that, and it depends upon the context of your life and your situation in life. If you don't have any money at all, then having a bit of money might make you a lot happier, because you'll be able to actually survive. But if you have a lot of money already, you don't need any more, because even if you did have excess money beyond what you already earn, it's not gonna, just buying material possessions isn't gonna make you any happier, I don't think. So again, there's this sort of balance, really. You've got to get the balance right. Later on in this chapter, Haidt talks about the different kinds of externals that might make you happy. And on page 91, he says, quote, "There are two fundamentally different kinds of externals: the conditions of your life and the voluntary activities that you undertake. Conditions include facts about your life that you can't change, like race, sex, age, disability, as well as things that you can: wealth, marital status, where you live. Conditions are constant over time, at least during a period in your life, and so they are the sorts of things that you are likely to adapt to. Voluntary activities, on the other hand, are the things that you choose to do, such as meditation, exercise, learning a new skill, or taking a vacation. Because such activities must be chosen, and because most of them take effort and attention, they can't just disappear from your awareness the way conditions can. Voluntary activities, therefore, offer much greater promise for increasing happiness while avoiding adaptation effects." End quote. So with voluntary activities, you can kind of do them almost regardless of the conditions, almost. And also, because you focus effort and attention on those voluntary activities, then it's much more likely that you'll enjoy those activities, because your whole field of concentration is on that one thing you're doing. Whereas with conditions in your life, like where you live and things, you're not really focusing on that all the time. You're not mindful of that. You just kind of take it for granted. It's just there. Whereas a voluntary activity actually forces you to concentrate on it, and that's why doing something can make you more happy in that sense. Later on in the chapter, Haidt investigates some research carried out by other positive psychologists. He says, quote, "One of the most important ideas in positive psychology is what Lyubomirsky, Sheldon, Schade, and Seligman call the happiness formula." And the happiness formula goes as follows: H equals S plus C plus V. What does this happiness formula mean? Well, the level of happiness that you actually experience, H, is determined by your biological set point, S, plus the conditions of your life, C, plus the voluntary activities, V, that you do. So as you can see here, this is a nice combination of all these different elements which come together to form happiness. It's not as though happiness just comes from one place. It comes from lots of different things, and this formula helps to illustrate that point. On page 92, Haidt discusses the particular external conditions for your happiness, and I've made a list of them here, and they go as follows. He discusses noise, so the condition of the amount of noise where you live can affect how happy you are. If you live in a more peaceful environment where there's not traffic and beeping cars and things, or at least even if you do live in a busy area, if you've got thick, what do they call them? Double glass windows, triple pane glass windows, to keep the sound out, then you're likely to be happier because you have more peace. Generally, the whole condition creates more peace. And then another external condition is commuting. So how do you get to work? Does it take you 3 hours, or do you even work from home and you don't have to travel at all? Or does it take you, like most people, it takes you about under an hour, maybe? If it takes you more than an hour, I think this could seriously kind of impact upon your happiness, because it takes away, because you feel as though time is being drained by commuting, by just getting from A to B. So ideally you want to live quite close to where you work. Another external condition is lack of control, or the level of control you have in your life. If, for instance, you don't have much control over your finances, that can reduce your level of happiness, because you're constantly worried about how much you earn, or how much you have. Whereas if you have control over your finances, then that increases your happiness. So there we have, not just with finances, but with other things, we have the importance of organisation. Be organised, and that will help you be happier. Then there's shame, and Haidt discusses this in relation to physical appearance. So often, if we don't attend to our hygiene, to the way we look, at least make some effort with our physical appearance, it can leave us feeling not very sort of happy about ourselves. So, I mean, this is a minor thing, and some people might think fashion is a bit shallow, but actually it can just at least paying it a little bit of attention can make you a bit happier. Then the final external condition, which Haidt points out as the most important external condition, is, of course, relationships. Relationships are so fundamental to your happiness, because they provide other people which can offer you emotional support, which you can have quality memories with, and the company of others in particular has a certain effect on you that is completely different than being alone. And if you cultivate relationships and you put attention into them, as opposed to, I don't know, looking at your phone when you're talking to people. I mean, I'm not saying that's necessarily wrong or anything. I mean, phones are useful and they're useful technology to use, but when you're actually in a conversation with someone, it's quite nice to actually give them your full attention. And you'll find that you get more enjoyment out of that as well. So focus on relationships there. Then later on in the chapter, Haidt discusses this idea of voluntary activities, of doing things, and how that will make you happy. On page 95, he talks about a discovery made by positive psychologist Mihail Csikszentmihalyi. He says, quote, Csikszentmihalyi's big discovery is that there is a state many people value even more than chocolate after sex. It is the state of total immersion in a task that is challenging, yet closely matched to one's abilities. It is what people sometimes call being in the zone. Csikszentmihalyi called it flow, because it often feels like effort. It often feels like effortless movement. Flow happens, and you go with it. End quote. So excuse my sneeze there. I was in the flow there doing that thing, and I sneezed. But the flow happens when you are completely absorbed in an activity, and it because your whole attention is fixated upon that activity and it's not distracted by anything else, you're able to reap the rewards of that activity. Not only that, but the particular activity that you're doing, you're both good at, and it's pushing your limits, it's challenging you. That creates a sense of flow. For instance, I don't know if you were really good at skiing, for instance. I'm not good at skiing, but if you were, you would choose a slope that's not too hard for you, but not too easy either. You choose a challenging slope that tests your boundaries, and that's probably likely to produce a state of flow when you go down it, you see. And later on in the chapter, Haidt discusses this idea of the paradox of choice and how that, as an external condition, might prevent your happiness, and also how to go about solving this problem. He says, quote, on page 101, "Choice and its frequent associate freedom are unquestioned goods of modern life. Yet, when people are actually given a larger array of choices, they are less likely to make a choice. And if they do, they are less satisfied with it. The more choices there are, the more you expect to find a perfect fit. Yet, at the same time, the larger the array, the less likely it becomes that you picked the best item. You leave the store less confident in your choice, more likely to feel regret, and more likely to think about the options you didn't choose. If you can avoid making a choice, you are more likely to do so. The psychologist Barry Schwartz calls this the paradox of choice. We value choice and put ourselves in situations of choice, even though choice often undercuts our happiness. But Schwartz and his colleagues find that the paradox mostly applies to people they call maximizers. Those who habitually try to evaluate all the options, seek out more information, and make the best choice, or maximize their utility, as economists would say. Other people, satisficers, are more laid back about their choice. They evaluate an array of options until they find one that is good enough, and then they stop looking. Satisficers are not hurt by a surfeit of options. Maximizers end up making slightly better decisions than satisficers, on average. All that worry and information gathering does help, but they are less happy with their decisions, and they are more inclined to depression and anxiety." End quote. So here we have two solutions to the paradox of choice. One isn't a very good one. One isn't a very good solution, which is to be a maximizer. I've definitely noticed this trait in myself, where I browse a shop for quite some time looking for something, and I just can't decide. I can't decide on the difference between that and that. Should I get this for this price? Should I get that for that price? And I go through all the options. And the more options there are, the more agonizing it is. And of course, that just makes me more depressed, being like that. But of course, if you have the attitude of a satisficer and you're satisfied with your choice, normally you don't actually even look at all the options. You just go in to the shop, you choose one that's okay for you and that seems to work, and then you go with it, and then you're happy with your choice. You don't mull on it or regret your choice in any way. Though you might not make as good a choice as you had if you were a maximizer, you would still feel happier about your choice than the maximizer, because the maximizer would constantly be worrying about it. So the solution here is to be a satisficer. Be satisfied with your choice and don't spend too long in the shop. Just go in, get it, go out. So that concludes this chapter. In chapter 6, Haidt expands upon this idea of relationships being so important to happiness. On page 132, he discusses this idea. He discusses research conducted by a sociologist, Emil Durkheim, who investigated what made people happy in his time and investigated which people were more satisfied with their life, which people were less satisfied with their life, and he came to some very interesting conclusions. And here is the quote. Haidt says, "In the late 19th century, one of the founders of sociology, Emil Durkheim, performed a scholarly miracle. He gathered data from across Europe to study the factors that affect the suicide rate. His findings can be summarized in one word: constraints. No matter how he parsed the data, people who had fewer social constraints, bonds, and obligations were more likely to kill themselves." Durkheim looked at the degree of integration into religious society and found that Protestants, who lived the least demanding religious lives at the time, had higher suicide rates than did Catholics, Jews, with the densest network of social and religious obligation had the lowest. He examined the degree of integration of domestic society, the family, and found the same thing. People living alone were more likely to kill themselves. Married people, less. Married people with children, still less. Durkheim concluded that people need obligations and constraints to provide structure and meaning to their lives. The more weakened the groups to which a man or woman belongs, the less he depends on them, the more he consequently depends only on himself and recognises no other rules of conduct than what are founded on his private interests. End quote. So that's a quite long one, but as you can see, it very clearly illustrates that a life of solitude and being on your own all the time, where that can, especially if you're introverted like me, that can produce lots of happiness. But at the same time, you can't be like that all the time throughout your whole life. Relationships add a lot of depth to your life that you simply wouldn't have if you spent your days on this earth alone. So the reason for that is this idea of obligations and constraints. Like, actually, if you have relationships with other people, especially, I don't know, if you're married or you have kids or something, you become responsible for those people. You have certain obligations to them. You do things, and you might think that might make you less happy, but actually it gives you a sense of purpose. And purpose is, of course, a major cause of happiness. If you can cultivate purpose in your life through doing things for others, etc., and all this, that increases your happiness because you feel as though you've done something good, you've done something selfless, and relationships give you the opportunity to be selfless in that sense. Also, obligations and constraints remove the paradox of choice. Depending solely on oneself for meaning in life may actually contribute to depression or other anxieties. However, I would add that independence and solitude is still important to cultivate, and if certain relationships are causing more pain than happiness for you, then you probably need to let them go. So again, you've got to be very careful with this advice, and what does it mean to you? Ask yourself that question. On page 133, Haidt insists, because of this research, that we need to interact and intertwine with others. We need the give and the take. We need to belong. An ideology of extreme personal freedom can be dangerous because it encourages people to leave homes, jobs, cities, and marriages in search of personal and professional fulfillment, thereby breaking the relationships that were probably their best hope for such fulfillment. End quote. And so there we have it. Again, if you break your attachments to people and relationships who are serving you well, then that might not be the best decision, because you will be relying on yourself to provide meaning in life completely, rather than other people do give you those obligations. And with those obligations, you can get a sense of purpose. At the same time, if other people are too demanding, if other people just want to take and take from you rather than give themselves, especially if people are abusive, then you do need to leave those relationships. So again, it's very context dependent. It depends on the kind of relationships you have. But in general, in good, stable relationships, it's better to stay in them. That's why it's better to stay in them than leave them. Haidt discusses this idea from the ancient philosopher Seneca. He says, quote, "Seneca was right. No one can live happily who has regard to himself alone and transforms everything into a question of his own utility. John Donne was right. No man, woman, or child is an island. Aristophanes was right. We need others to complete us. We are an ultra-social species, full of emotions, finely tuned for loving, befriending, helping, sharing, and otherwise intertwining our lives with others. Attachments and relationships can bring us pain. As a character in Jean-Paul Sartre's play No Exit said, hell is other people, but so is heaven. End quote. In Chapter 7, Haidt discusses the potential uses of adversity. Adversity is another word for challenges or setbacks in your life that might happen. We all experience various degrees of trauma in our lives, some worse than others, some in a more unique way. Either way, they are all unique to us, these traumas. They all very personal to us, and they all mean so much to us, and often affect how we feel about life and affect our whole entire attitude towards them. So this one might be an interesting concept to consider in your pursuit of happiness. On page 136, Haidt says, quote, "This chapter is about the adversity hypothesis, which says that people need adversity, setbacks, and perhaps even trauma to reach the highest levels of strength, fulfillment, and personal development." End quote. And this can obviously be a very controversial theory, because people might think that trauma is ultimately negative. You know, there's nothing good to be found in certain kinds of trauma. And so Haidt sort of reassures us later on in the quote, "Let's be cautious about accepting the adversity hypothesis. Let's look to scientific research to figure out when adversity is beneficial and when it is harmful. The answer is not just adversity within limits. It's a much more interesting story, one that reveals how human beings grow and thrive, and how you and your child can best profit from the adversity that surely lies in your future." End quote. So what Haidt is saying here is that you have to have a very almost a kind of skeptical approach to this theory, because in some cases certain trauma might actually be so bad that its effects are worse than good. Though you can learn really from any trauma, if a trauma is particularly bad, it's still bad. It's still negative. So again, don't go looking for trauma. Just allow trauma to happen to you if it does. On page 138, Haidt says, quote, "Although traumas, crises, and strategies come in 1,000 forms, people benefit from them in 3 primary ways. The first way," he says, quote, "the first benefit is that rising to a challenge reveals your hidden abilities, and seeing these abilities changes your self-concept. None of us knows what we are really capable of doing." And later on, he says, quote, "One of the most common lessons people draw from bereavement or trauma is that they are much stronger than they realize, and this new appreciation of their strength then gives them confidence to face future challenges." End quote. So here we have this idea that through the trauma, you actually discover a certain strength within yourself, or a certain number of strengths within yourself that you didn't know existed before you had the trauma. You get a sense of, therefore, confidence, because you realize that, oh, I am able to cope with this particular problem. I didn't think I was going to be able to cope with it, but afterwards I actually realize I can. And that can improve your self-esteem, confidence. It can improve so many areas of your life by this simply realizing and becoming aware that you are much more capable and you have so much more potential as a human being than you initially thought. The second, as he says, quote, "the second class of benefit concerns relationships." So here come relationships again. "Adversity is a filter. When a person is diagnosed with cancer, or a couple loses a child, some friends and family members rise to the occasion and look for any way they can to support or be helpful." end quote. So again, we return to this idea of happiness, of relationships as a cause for happiness, in that through adversity, the those people who are closest to you, or who simply know you and want to help, they will suddenly care more about you because of what has happened, or they not necessarily care more about you as if they didn't care about you in the first place, but maybe focus more attention on you, and give you support and be helpful, etc. And you can then realize, almost sort the wheat from the chaff, realize which relationships weren't very caring or supportive and which relationships are. So it's a good, as Haidt says, it's a good filter for discovering the real, authentic relationships compared to the sort of fake ones that where they didn't really care about you, but they just wanted things from you. And Haidt says, quote, "The third common benefit: trauma changes priorities and philosophies toward the present, live each day to the fullest, and toward other people." So this is the idea that trauma actually changes your whole attitude altogether towards life. It changes the way you see life, the way you see other trauma, the way later in life you're actually then more prepared for trauma in the future, because you see what it's like, and from that sense of seeing what it's like, you become more grateful then for what you do have, and you live more in the present, and you become more grateful for the other people in your life. And so in summary, it makes you a better person. Haidt says in the next quote, "Suffering is not always bad for all people. There is usually some good mixed in with the bad, and those who find it have found something precious, a key to moral and spiritual development. As Shakespeare wrote, 'Sweet are the uses of adversity, which, like the toad, ugly and venomous, wears yet a precious jewel in its head.'" End quote. In chapter 8, Haidt discusses the importance of virtue in your quest for happiness. What is virtue? Virtue is a strength you have, or a particular quality about you. Each of us, as human beings, we each grow up with different virtues. Some of those virtues might get praised by others, some people might not recognize them at all. But we all have certain virtues in our life which make us who we are, and which make us distinguished and unique as individuals. On page 156, Haidt says, "Hard-won virtues are especially admirable to us, because they reveal a depth and authenticity of character that we don't see in the obedient kid who simply accepts the virtues he was raised with." End quote. So, as Haidt is saying here, virtues are often won the hard way. Virtues are often won through diligent work, diligent practice at life, and kind of experimentation with life, if you like. This is how virtue is really won, not through simply being told by someone else, "Oh, you should be a kind and caring person." If a teacher teaches you you should be a kind and caring person, that might be useful, but that's only one step in the right direction if you listen to that. To actually enact that in life requires a lot of effort, and sometimes you might have to go through being nasty to other people or being unkind to realize that you then need to be kind. So you need that obstacle there to overcome, you see. And that's how virtues are hard won. On page 157, Haidt talks about Aristotle. He says, quote, "Aristotle said that a good life is one where you develop your strengths, realize your potential, and become what it is in your nature to become." Aristotle believed that all things in the universe had telos, or purpose toward which they were aimed, even though he did not believe that the gods had designed all these things. End quote. So, despite living in a seemingly meaningless universe, where you have to cultivate your own meaning, you have to cultivate your own sense of purpose, it seems as though in helping you to do that, you need to develop your own strengths. Your strengths are actually a reflection of, and are actually foundations for your very purpose in life. So if you're very good at public speaking, for instance, you might probably fare better in a job where you speak to lots of people because you don't experience stage fright. It's not a problem for you. You do it very well. Likewise, if you're very good at learning things, you might be a very good teacher because you're fascinated by the idea of learning and by sharing the power of learning with other people. So we all have certain strengths about us, and it's about finding what those are. And in order to find what these are, Haidt discusses an investigation or research conducted by positive psychologists Martin Seligman and Chris Peterson. He says, quote, psychologists Martin Seligman and Chris Peterson created a manual for common strengths and virtues which we might encounter in our lives. They come in 6 categories. 1, wisdom. So this involves curiosity, love of learning, judgment, ingenuity, emotional intelligence, and perspective. Then 2 is courage. This includes valor, perseverance, integrity. 3, humanity. This includes kindness and loving. 4, justice, citizenship, fairness, and leadership. 5, temperance, self-control, prudence, humility. And finally 6, transcendence, appreciation of beauty and excellence, gratitude, hope, spirituality, forgiveness, humour, and zest. So these are the different virtues that Seligman and Peterson identified in their research, and obviously these are constantly in flux and up for challenge and change and so on. But these are just ideas, and they are quite good ideas, I think. And so to discover which of these strengths is good for you, you can actually take the strengths test, as Haidt says, at www.authentichappiness.org to discover your highest strengths in life. And I'll put that link down below so you can access that after watching this video. And Haidt summarizes virtues in this chapter by saying on page 169, quote, work on your strengths, not your weaknesses. You don't really have to be good at everything. Life offers so many chances to use one tool instead of another, and often you can use a strength to get around a weakness. End quote. Chapter 9 discusses this whole concept of divinity, why it's important, and the fact that you or anyone in this world has a sense of or sense for divinity, whether or not you believe in God. So, as Haidt says on page 183, in all human cultures, the social world has 2 clear dimensions. A horizontal dimension of closeness or liking, and a vertical one of hierarchy or status. And as Haidt explains later, he says, quote, my claim is that the human mind perceives a 3rd dimension, a specifically moral dimension that I will call divinity. The human mind simply does perceive divinity and sacredness, whether or not God exists. End quote. Now, if you don't believe in God, if you're an atheist, you might consider this idea of divinity a bit wishy-washy. But actually, it's a very raw sensation, divinity. If you hold something as divine, essentially you hold it as important. We all, even if we don't believe in God, we hold things in our lives as very sacred to us, like our family or our career, etc. We might hold that very close, even if we don't have any religious beliefs. So he says later in the chapter, quote, "Most cultures are very concerned about food, sex, menstruation, and the handling of corpses." And later he says, As I read further, I began to discern an underlying logic, the logic of disgust. According to the leading theory of disgust in the 1980s by Paul Rozin, disgust is largely about animals and the products of animal bodies. Few plants or inorganic materials are disgusting, and disgusting things are contagious by touch. So if, say, you've read about, you've ever read parts of the Bible, especially parts like Leviticus, which have all these very strange rules about menstruation in women and what you should and shouldn't do with your food and how you should eat and etc. And lots of, not just Christianity, but lots of religions and cultures have this sense of disgust for certain things and a sense of sacredness, because they're trying to separate the dying things from the things that are sacred. And believe it or not, we actually have this as humans, whether or not we're religious. As Haidt says in his quote, "Disgust makes us careful about contact, but the most fascinating thing about disgust is that it is recruited to support so many of the norms, rituals, and beliefs that cultures often use to define themselves. For example, many cultures draw a sharp line between humans and animals, insisting that people are somehow above, better than, or more godlike than the other animals." End quote. And this is true, actually. We do, as humans, we believe we are more important than the other animals. For example, if we murder a pig, that's actually okay. In fact, we murder lots of pigs on a daily basis, so we can eat pork and actually eat them. But if someone then murdered a human being and ate that human being in an act of cannibalism, that's actually the same thing, but it's not the same thing, because we would think that's absolutely disgusting. We would think that's just cannibalism, that's absolutely disgusting. But why do we think that's disgusting? Because our culture has told us that. Now, I'm not saying that you should go out and be a cannibal. I mean, that's awful. Don't ever do it. But this is the idea that disgust forms as a very subtle part of our cultures and societies, and is often the reason why we sometimes reel back whenever we go traveling and see a certain type of thing that people are doing, that we kind of think, oh, why are they doing it like that? When actually, to them, it's normal. So this idea of disgust is evidence of the fact that we hold some things as more sacred than other things, because disgust is at the bottom of the divinity scale, whereas things at the top, like ideals, abstract ideals like love, etc., are at the top of the divinity scale, you see. And later on in this chapter, Haidt discusses this concept of awe, and how awe is often a part of religions. He says in page 202, quote, "Awe is the emotion of self-transcendence." And expanding on that, he says, quote, "The emotion of awe happens when two conditions are met. A person perceives something vast, usually physically vast, but sometimes conceptually vast, such as a grand theory, or socially vast, such as great fame or power. And the vast thing cannot be accommodated by the person's existing mental structures. Something enormous can't be processed. And when people are stopped in their cognitive tracks while in the presence of something vast, they feel small, powerless, passive, and receptive. They often, though not always, feel fear, admiration, elevation, or a sense of beauty as well. By stopping people and making them receptive, awe creates an opening for change, and this is why awe plays a role in most stories of religious conversion. End quote. So if you examine salvation and the role that plays in lots of religions, it's normally accompanied with a sense of awe, a sense of that's awesome, or that's amazing. If often, and relates to happiness, because often if you come out of an experience, you go on a roller coaster ride or something, and you come off that roller coaster ride and you say, "Oh, that roller coaster ride was awesome." Now, of course, the reason it is awesome is because it couldn't be the experience couldn't be rationally comprehended. The mind couldn't accommodate for the exciting twists and turns of the roller coaster, and the whole rush of the experience was incredibly emotional. It was beyond thought, beyond belief. And when we can capture these kinds of awesome experiences, that is also a potential generator of happiness. On page 211, Haidt then discusses how this concept of awe makes the study of religion worthwhile, whereas many people in today's secular society would kind of poo-poo religion. They say, "Oh, don't even look at it." He says, quote, "If the third dimension and perceptions of sacredness are an important part of human culture, then the scientific community should accept religiosity as a normal and healthy aspect of human nature, an aspect that is as deep, important, and interesting as sexuality or language, which we study intensely." Here's another treasonous thought. If religious people are right in believing that religion is the source of their greatest happiness, then maybe the rest of us who are looking for happiness and meaning can learn something from them, whether or not we believe in God. End quote. So when it comes to spirituality, it's definitely worth looking into. Spirituality for me doesn't necessarily mean you have to believe in anything. It just means you need to examine those kind of awesome experiences sometimes you get, and examine perhaps the mysteries of life, or look to different religions and wonder why they have these certain strange practices and so on, and because there is a reason behind everything, I think so anyway, but that reason can't really always be comprehended by the rational mind, as we're so led to believe by science, is that everything can be understood by the rational mind, but actually there are some experiences that encapsulate this idea of awe where the rational mind can't break through. In chapter 10, Haidt sums up the happiness hypothesis, and he brings it to a conclusion and places it in the context of your life and says, how can you then practically embody the happiness hypothesis and everything we've discussed in all the previous chapters so far? He says on page 238, the final version of the happiness hypothesis is that happiness comes from between. Happiness is not something that you can find, acquire, or achieve directly. You have to get the conditions right and then wait, end quote. And you can compare this, and I think Haidt does this, by comparing it to growing a flower. Happiness is like a flower. You have to get the conditions right of the greenhouse and then just let the flower grow, let it bloom of its own accord. And that is how to actually create happiness. You can't just immediately bring it. If you're really sad and you're really upset, or you feel really depressed, and angry about life or something, it's difficult to just bring happiness like that and just say, oh, I'm happy now. It doesn't work like that. Happiness takes time to grow, and you need the right conditions. And of course, it comes from both external conditions and the internal. And what I really like about what Haidt has done here is that he's mixed Eastern and Western philosophies together in order to present a very convincing case for the possibility of happiness. So all you have to do is act upon, or all you have to do is act upon this theory if you wish to achieve the results. The more you put in, the more you'll get out. So that is how you put this happiness hypothesis into practice. Although he does have some very practical notes, which I'll give to you here. He says on page 239, it is worth striving to get the right relationships between yourself and others, between yourself and your work, and between yourself and something larger than yourself. End quote. So if you're stuck on this pursuit of happiness, which is a very complex thing, he says that you can just focus on three things. Focus on your relationships with other people. See how you can improve those, for one thing. Secondly, focus on your work. Does your work give you a sense of purpose? Does your work give you a sense of meaning? Do you feel through your work that you're making a contribution to the world, or are you just doing it for money? Really look into that, really study that and examine that for yourself. And then finally, between yourself and something larger than yourself, this could either be a kind of spiritual cause, but it could also just be a very sort of worldly cause, like a charity or something. You've got to see that you are not the center of the universe, and that there is something larger and more awesome going on about life. So that is how we'll end our review of the happiness hypothesis. I hope you've enjoyed this review, and stay around for the next episode of Lawson Literature.